Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Bogtastic Webcast from Moors for the Future Partnership. I'm Jodie, and we're here with Jackie Ragg today. So this is the latest in a series of webcasts that we're doing while we can't get out and about in person to talk to people about our beloved moors. Bogtastic Webcasts are part of our More Life 2020 project, which is funded by the EU Life programme, Yorkshire Water, United Utilities and Severn Trent. And today it is Natura 2000 Day, celebrating protected areas in Europe. And so today we have a webcast from Jackie Ragg, who is our Youth Engagement Officer, and she's giving us a mini lesson about food webs on blanket bogs and how species are adapted to live there. She'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then there'll be time afterwards for you to ask plenty of questions, which Jackie will answer for us. So please ask your questions in the chat on the right-hand side. I can see that there is an issue with Martha's sound and screen. Try pressing refresh, Martha. Look out for, we've got a few little quizzes and polls for you today to do, so look out on the right hand side for those, and a handout as well. And yeah, I was going to say to people, if there is an issue, then try pressing the refresh button and let us know if that works. Great, that's brilliant. Thanks, Martha. So I'll hand over now to Jackie. So off you go. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks Jodie. I'm really glad to be doing this again, and it's really sunny outside again, so I'm glad that some people have come indoors to spend a bit of time with us, as we can't get out and see people in person, which is something we love to do. So it's the second in a series of mini lessons. So we had one last week, which is available on YouTube to watch, and this is the second one, looking in a bit more focused at the biotic factors, or the living features of blanket bog ecosystems. So just going to do a quick poll. And oh, you're answering it already. Oh, you're all so quick. So yes, quick poll here while I tell you about what we're doing in today's mini lesson. Have you seen the first webcast about ecosystems, and we looked at the inner workings and what makes the system work and how complicated it is? So yeah, just to answer that while I'm talking. Oh, we've got everybody there so far. Good. So there's a couple of 30% of the audience haven't seen the webcast one. So if you haven't, you can go back and watch that on YouTube. And, you know, if there's some elements of this where you think, oh, that doesn't, you know, make a lot of sense to me, it's, you know, it's good to start and have a look at that one first to kind of bring you back when you've finished watching today and taking part. Jodie said you can actually take part during the experience in the chat on the right hand side. I will be asking people to get involved, and those of you that were here last week, everyone got involved, and it was great to have that. So if you can get involved, do get involved, and if you're not watching live, then I'm sorry you can't actually answer any of the questions that way, but you can answer them just, you know, verbally. Okay, so what are we going to look at today? Well, we're going to look at what are food chains and food webs. As with last week, this lesson is kind of aimed at that sort of introduction and GCSE level science and geography, but also anyone that's interested in blanket bogs and species adaptations and wildlife is going to find this interesting, hopefully. So yes, food chains and food webs. And we're also going to learn some key terms that help us to classify animals and plants in a food chain and a food web. So they're the key terms there, which we'll have a look at today. And then towards the end, we're going to have a look at how two plant species are perfectly suited to life in what is quite a challenging environment, living in a blanket bog ecosystem. We'll understand why that is challenging from looking back at the ecosystem webcast, but also we'll cover a little bit today as a bit of a recap. Okay, so let's get straight into those food chain and food webs definitions. So a food chain and a food web, are both linked to feeding relationships in an ecosystem or habitat. So where is the energy moving into from each species? That's what we're looking at in a food chain and a food web. A food chain is quite simple. If you think about a chain, like a chain you'd wear around your neck, it's one continuous, like a string with links in it. So a food chain is from one organism to the next, quite simple and straightforward. There's no branching. It's quite a straightforward line. Whereas in a food web, it's actually a lot of the different food chains in a habitat all linked together. So branching off, different things eat more than one type of prey, for example. So it does look a bit more complicated. And food chains, really, it's a good way to understand direct movement of energy from one species to the next in a simplistic way. And sometimes you use food pyramids, which is like a representation of a food chain because it only has one chain of species, whereas a food web, much more complex, and it does reflect the complexity of the ecosystem. Okay, so let's have a look at an example of a food web. Now, before I go into too much detail about this, it looks complicated, but in reality, if I was to carry on adding arrows and adding species, it would become drastically more complicated than this. But this is a really good place to start. And also, we talk about habitats like the blanket bog habitat. They're very specific habitats, and we need to remember that they don't exist in isolation. So some animals might not actually nest on a blanket bog, or they might not actually take refuge on a blanket bog, but they might forage or hunt on a blanket bog habitat. So that's why some of the species you might look and think, well, actually, I don't think that would live in a blanket bog, but it could be in an adjacent habitat and therefore still depend on that network of habitats that are all linked together. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the examples here. If you look at the bottom of the food web, you'll notice that the three things at the bottom have got a similarity. If you want to type it in the box, you can get involved. Can anyone tell me what's similar about the three bottom boxes on the food web? This is a good chance to practice and see if you're typing in the chat box comes up. I should be able to see it. Yes, they're all plants. Thank you, Clover. Who's also got a name that's related to plants, which I love. So yes, they're all plants. So the bottom of the food web there that we can see is all plant species. Now, one thing to look at now, I'm going to focus in on the heather to identify another difference that food web diagrams don't show us. So we've got a bilberry bumblebee and a grouse. Both of those things have got an arrow pointing to them from the heather. Now, most people would instantly go, well, that shows what eats what. But if you are defining that arrow and what it shows the movement of energy. So we've got to think about it in that way to really help us understand it. So it shows the movement of energy. And at every level, energy is actually lost. So the heather has a certain amount of energy in its body, in its biomass. And then when that moves to the bilberry bumblebee, the bilberry bumblebee moves around, it respires, some of that energy is lost. And then as you move further and further up the food web, that energy is lost again and again until you get to the top with the short-eared owl, where there's less energy. That's why the short-eared owl has to eat a lot. So if you do get questions, remember, if you think of them and you want to just shout them out, just put them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end. So that's really good. If you've got questions, we can have a chat at the end. So yes, back to the heather. So the bilberry bumblebee and the grouse both get energy from the heather, but in very different ways. So the grouse actually feeds on the new shoots of the heather, but the bilberry bumblebee gets energy from the heather, might actually take some nectar from the heather for direct energy, or it might take pollen from the heather and use that pollen to feed larvae. So it just says heather in the box, but you've got heather shoots, you've got the heather pollen, you've got the nectar. So there's always further to look into each of those things. The same as with the mountain hare, it might, a buzzard, for example, you can see the energy moving from the hare to the buzzard. Might not take an adult hare, it could take a leveret though. So you've always got to think about those differences, and how, you know, some species might not be predated on when they're adults, but could be when they're young. So it's quite complicated. Let's see if anybody can identify a food chain. So in here, there's lots of food chains, all visible. So can anyone type a direct food chain, starting with the plant at the bottom and ending with something further up? So it might be 3 species, it might be, I can see ones with 3, I can see ones with 4, I think. Right, so we've got heather, water vole, buzzard. Let's follow it up the chain. So I'm just checking it. Heather, straight to the water vole, straight to the buzzard. Perfect. Yes, heather, grouse. Oh, I'm going to go heather, grouse. The grouse seems, it looks like it's got no natural predators, which is a good example of why this food web isn't entirely telling all the story, because the grouse obviously does have predators. And I think what you've said would make sense. That, you know, Annabelle, what you've said would make sense in reality. So you could put more arrows on there. I think Annabelle's seeing a bit further into it, and that's really good. So let's have a look. I've highlighted one. So there's a food chain. The cotton grass, the large heath caterpillar eating the cotton grass, and then the skylark eating the caterpillar, which is eating the buzzard. So you can see the movement of energy through the food web. So there we go. So it's very complicated, a food web, and it does show you that all the species, whether they are connected directly or indirectly, will be affected by changes. And well done everyone for all your answers, because I was really impressed with that. There's quite a few that have come up in there. I know it's fast typing as well you've got to do, so well done. Yeah, so it is complicated. And if you look at one species and think about if it declined in population, how would it affect the rest of the food web? You'll find, you know, it is quite a delicate thing. Complex food webs can be a bit less delicate than very simple ones, because there's less, you know, there's more species there to take the fall if something changes. Okay, so I've put some activities in the PowerPoint slides that you're going to be given at the end with about food webs, so you can have a little look into that as well. Okie dokie, so if you weren't here last week, this is what you missed out on, my brilliant drawings. I did draw some animals on the habitat of Blanket Bog last week. So question for everybody to think about that energy, because if we look back at this, it starts with the plants and the energy moves from the plants, but we know there's something that's below that, and there's energy moving into the plants. They don't just, yes, Annabelle, the sun. So the sun, through photosynthesis, is bringing the energy into this food web. And that's what makes the plants so important, because they've got a special ability to turn the sun's energy into energy that they can use making sugars. Exactly. So we don't have that ability. The animals that are depicted in there don't have that ability. So without those, I don't want to say a keyword that we're going to use later, but they're producing their own energy from the sun, and we're not capable of doing that. And none of the animals in that picture are either. So we've already assessed that and established that the energy is coming from the sun. So let's see, in terms of this energy and how animals and plants use it, if we can classify some animals and plants with some different key terms. So I've put some definitions on there. Producers are animals that can make their own energy without having to consume another organism. So I haven't just put plants on there, because actually plants are what we call photoautotrophs, which is quite a long word, but it just means they're light self-feeders, so they feed themselves using light. You also get something called a chemoautotroph, which is something that feeds itself using chemicals and breaking down chemicals. So quite an interesting thing, but it's more common when we talk about producers to be talking about plants, because they're just more common ecosystems where everything's founded on plants. So producers manufacture their own food. Consumers have to consume something else, have to eat something else to get their energy. Detritivores eat dead organic matter, so it could be leaf litter or it could be a dead organism, another dead organism. And then you've got decomposers, which are bacteria and fungi, which break down at a smaller level and could be even inside the gut of another animal. They're still classed as decomposers and still part of that whole process of energy being broken down and then made back available into the ecosystem. So key terms that are, they look quite complicated, but in reality they're not too bad. So we're going to do a quick poll, which is 2 questions, and we've got some examples of animals or plants and what term might be used for them. So there's 2 here. Oh, you can just see one of them, I think, at the moment. Which of these is a consumer? That's the one I can see on my screen anyway, apart from that last one. So if you have a look, and oh, you've got 2. So you can scroll down so you can see which of these is a consumer. So which of these has to eat something else to make its energy, and which of these is a producer, so which of these actually makes its own energy, doesn't need to eat anything, it just uses the sunlight to make energy in this respect. Okay, we've got 80% of the audience has answered on 90% of the audience on the other one. So have a think about it. There's no massive rush. Just while the last person's answering, I haven't asked questions about detritivores and decomposers, but that is a fascinating part of the food web, and people often ask that question, where do the decomposers fit? That is quite complicated, and people often have a decomposer cycle that's that sort of part of it, but almost separate and considered a bit separate to it. But it's an important part of the movement of the energy back into the ecosystem. So it is worth looking into as well. Right, so we've got 100% of the audience. Yes, so which of these is a producer? Cotton grass is the producer. That's the plant in there. So well done if you put cotton grass. And which is a consumer? So we've got cotton grass bilberry or bilberry bumblebee. So the bilberry bumblebee is the consumer. So the bilberry is a plant and the cotton grass is a plant as well. To be honest, I should have specified that in the options because it's, it's not evident from that. So well done if you got those right as well, and with my lack of information there. So what about applying those terms to this habitat? Producers, consumers, detritivores and decomposers. So we're just going to do a quick one in the chat. If you can see a producer, type it in the box. You don't need to identify the species, but if you can see a plant you recognise or something like a general group, you can pop it on there. And if not, I'll point one out. Yes, sphagnum moss. Yes, heather. I think there's some bilberry as well in the front left, and there's definitely some purple moorgrass in there too. What about consumers? Yes, Martha. What about consumers? Can anyone see any consumers? Yes, the frog, the plover. Well done, Clover. Well done, Robbie. Alice. Yes, the spider. The 4-spot orb weaver. Beautiful spider. What about a detritivore? Something that eats dead. Oh, she's right in there. Yeah, the detritivore actually eats dead organic matter. So we've got a lot of slugs popping up right now. So the slug is still a consumer. It still consumes things to make energy, but specifically, it falls into that category of detritivores. Can anyone see any decomposers? They're too small. So the bacteria and the fungi, you could see where they might exist in that layer of soil or the peat in the centre and on the right, but you can't see them. Yeah, you guys are really impressive. I'm definitely impressed by that knowledge. Well done. Okay, so we've got a really good understanding there of the food web, and in the last bit of the today's session, we're just going to look at 2 plants that live in blanket bog ecosystems specifically and how they are adapted to life there. Now, it's worth just mentioning the evolution of the plants has taken millennia, but it's given them these characteristics that make them so suited to this particular ecosystem. So when they talk about survival of the fittest, it doesn't really mean fit as in I'm really fit and healthy. It means fit as in suited to the environment. So these two plants are particularly suited to the environment. These are the conditions we talked about last time. Waterlogged soils, high temperature range is exposed, so it could get quite cold, and it could also be quite exposed to the sun when it's hot. Low nutrients and acidic conditions. So how do plants adapt to having low nutrients? Well, let's find out. Okay, so we've got two plants to look at, two favourites. Round-leaved sundew, which is actually a carnivorous plant, so its adaptation to get nutrients is to become a carnivore. So we'll have a look at how that works. And we're also going to look at sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss actually does modify its environment to make it more suitable for itself and less suitable for other plants, which is a very sneaky way of outcompeting everything else. So we'll start with the deadly sundew. I think you'll agree that if you're an insect, and there is an insect in this picture in the centre that's squashed inside this plant, it's quite deadly. If you've ever, has anyone been to the garden centre and seen the Venus flytraps? I know I always get told off for putting my finger there and getting the Venus flytrap to close tight. There are other insectivorous plants in the blanket bog ecosystem, and it's a good adaptation to not having the nutrients you need available in the soil. So if you have a look back at the original picture of the sundew on the left hand side, you can see that when it's opened out, it's got this the green section like the leaf section, and then it's got these what we call tentacles. I mean, that's the fun name for it. There's tentacles around the outside, and this is a trap basically. So if you have a look closer at the tentacles, which could be as many as 200 tentacles, they've got a sweet sticky dew that coats all the tentacles, and it attracts insects. So if you think about nectar, the purpose of nectar in a plant is to attract insects, and that is what happens with the sundew. So it attracts an unknowing insect passing by, flies down and thinks, oh, this is nice, sweet, sticky dew. Oh, actually, it's really sticky. I'm stuck. So these insects can get stuck in the plant. Now, as the plant closes on the insect probably, it's not a great way to go, but it probably takes about 15 minutes on average, I've read, for the insect to die, because it might exhaust itself trying to get free, or it could be suffocated by its breathing apparatus being covered up by the plant. But how does it work? Now, if you do science, which some of you will, some of you watching will have done science, learning about reflexes is something that you do in science, and this is what's happening with the sundew. So when the sundew feels in its receptors the movement of the insect, then the tentacles start to curl round, and that is the effect of this that's the reflex that's associated with it on these receptors. Now, what's really fascinating is scientists don't really know the exact mechanics of how it works, but in some sundew, like this one here, the leaf actually curls round as well. So not just the tentacles, but the whole leaf curls round. And that process is a chain of many different things happening. So hormones get released in which actually cause some of the cells to move hydrogen ions from the cell membrane to the cell wall, and then this actually causes an increase in acidity, and that actually causes the cell to expand and change shape. So this is what kind of drives the movement, is the change in shapes of the cells. It's very complicated, but massively interesting, and love it that we don't know everything about it yet. When that's happened, it's not the end of the story, because the insect being trapped in there, it's not really the end. When when that insect's trapped, the enzymatic juices are then secreted, which break down that insect. So they're full of enzymes, just like our saliva is, and that breaks down the insect, and then the minerals from the insect are absorbed into the plant. It's all pretty interesting stuff. So yeah, very good adaptation. Now I can see we've got time to look at the other plant, which is good, which is sphagnum. And we talk about sphagnum a lot. That's because it's fascinating. Lots of questions popping up about the sundew. I'm glad, because we can talk about that at the end. So let's have a look at super sphagnum. I've demonized the sundew and I've made the sphagnum look like a superhero. So I'm sorry, but it is obviously just how it has to be. So the super sphagnum, if we look at the sphagnum plant here in the picture, there's three things we want to say about sphagnum and what makes it so suited to its environment. Let's look at how it engineers its own environment first. So the sphagnum obviously needs nutrients like any other plant, but sphagnum is a moss. So it's different to, for example, the cotton grass or the heather or a bilberry, because they are what you call vascular plants. They're quite different. So a moss belongs to this group called bryophytes. They don't have the same structure, and they absorb nutrients just through their leaves in diffusion. So it's sat in a pool of water with some nutrients in it, and the nutrients can absorb into the sphagnum through that solution of water around it. So for that reason, it doesn't get nutrients from the same place as some of the other plants that have roots. So that's one way that sets it apart. But also, when it's absorbing these nutrients, in this case, we talk about nutrients like we're talking about sort of a magnesium or a calcium or a nitrogen. They could be absorbing different minerals and different elements from the water. But when they do that, they give out hydrogen ions. Now, a hydrogen ion is directly linked to acidity. So the more hydrogen ions there are, the more acidic the water will be. So over time, the sphagnum just makes everything more acidic. And sphagnum really lives well in acidic conditions, but a lot of other plants don't. So it allows it to eliminate the competition and really get in there and spread out a nice big carpet. Great adaptation. What about reproduction? Well, sphagnum has really versatile option. It's got two options for reproduction, and versatility is one of the really good ways to get to survive in an environment. So they can actually produce sexually by emitting spores. So the spores then obviously transfer to another area, and that's mixing the genetic pool of the sphagnum. Or they can produce asexually, which means a small bit of it could break off, and then that small piece of sphagnum can become another plant. That would actually be a genetic copy of the sphagnum, the parent plant. So versatility, great adaptation. And the last thing is the water storage. We know sphagnum exists in waterlogged conditions. Depending on the species, it's different conditions that it likes, but in general it's adapted and absorbs a lot of water. So it actually stores, the estimates say, up to 20 times its own weight in water. And the way it does that, if you have a look, is in the structure of the cells. So in the branch, this is like a picture of a close-up to show what the cells look like in the branches of the sphagnum. And the branches have chlorophyll cells in them, so you can see those, they're the green ones, so they complete the photosynthesis. But inside there's a network of these hyaline cells that actually die when they mature. So they're dead cells, but they've got lots of space because they're full of pores, and they can expand and they can change size and contract. So actually, if the sphagnum is surrounded by a large volume of water, it can absorb a large volume of water, and as the water levels go down, sphagnum can release the water as well. So that is obviously a really important adaptation, because it can, it's hard for it to desiccate as well. It can desiccate, it can dry out, but it's quite difficult. It's quite marvelous stuff. There's even more to research about that. So if you're particularly interested, do look into it, because there's definitely more research to be done into that. I hope that you found that helpful and interesting, and let's get on to the questions.